Right now, as you are watching this, Europe is on fire, not metaphorically, not as a warning about what might happen in future decades. Literally, at this moment, across the continent that is warming faster than any other landmass on this planet, walls of flame are tearing through forests, hillsides, and communities at a speed and ferocity that is outpacing everything scientists modeled even 5 years ago. 13 people are confirmed dead in Spain's Almería region after wildfire ripped through 7,000 hectares of countryside in 4 days. An area of historic forest in Fontainebleau, 40 kilometers from the center of Paris, has been burning, forcing railway closures and highway shutdowns in one of the most densely populated corridors in Western Europe. In the same summer, more than 10,000 excess deaths have already been recorded across the continent from extreme heat alone, and the fire season is not finished, not even close. The European Forest Fire Information System, which uses satellite data to track every significant fire across the continent, confirmed that 2025 was the most destructive wildfire season in EU history since records began in 2006. More than 1 million hectares burned inside the European Union alone, an area roughly the size of the entire island of Cyprus, consumed in a single year. Spain accounted for more than a third of those emissions. Portugal experienced the largest wildfire in its recorded history. Germany, Cyprus, and Slovakia all set all-time national burned area records in the same season. And this is not a story about one bad year. It is a story about a trajectory. Every decade, the fires are starting earlier. Every decade, they are burning hotter. Every decade, the countries that thought they had escaped the worst are discovering that the worst has simply moved north. This is not normal summer news. This is what the convergence of two simultaneous crises looks like when they are allowed to build unchecked for decades and then collide at full force. And today, we are going to break down exactly what is driving this, why Europe is uniquely and dangerously exposed, what the science says about where this is heading, and what the gap between countries that have responded and countries that have not tells us about how much of this destruction was actually preventable. No guessing, no dramatizing. The facts, the science, the real stakes, and the honest answer to the question every person watching this should be asking. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? If you live anywhere in Southern Europe, if you have been evacuated, if you have watched smoke columns from a holiday balcony or driven past a landscape that used to be forest and is now charcoal, tell me your story. Thousands of you have been through this firsthand, and those accounts are more powerful than any statistic I can read to you. Subscribe to this channel right now if you want updates every time a situation like this develops. It is completely free. The thumbs up also gets this video to people who need to see it before the next heat wave arrives. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one. Now let us get into it. To understand what is happening in Europe right now, you need to understand something that almost never appears in the mainstream coverage of these fires. The destruction you are seeing is not simply the result of climate change acting alone. It is the result of climate change colliding with a second crisis that has been building quietly across the European continent for 5 decades, a crisis of abandoned land. Dr. Juan Pecos, a forest fire scientist at the University of Vigo in Spain, who has spent his career reconstructing wildfire events and studying what makes a landscape catastrophically combustible, describes it using a metaphor that is as simple as it is devastating. He calls it the collision of two trains. The first train is climate change. It is coming fast, it is visible, and it is accelerating. The second train is the radical transformation of the European rural landscape over the last 50 years, and most people have never even noticed it. Over the course of the 20th century, millions of European farming and grazing families abandoned the countryside. Agricultural work that had shaped and maintained the landscape for generations came to an end as populations moved to cities. Fields stopped being plowed. Hillsides stopped being grazed. Terraces that had been maintained by hand for centuries fell into disrepair. And into the space left behind by all of that human activity, vegetation moved. Shrubs, grasses, young trees, thick undergrowth. An enormous and continuous blanket of dry biomass spreading across the slopes and valleys of Spain, Portugal, southern France, Italy, and Greece, with nothing to interrupt it and nothing to manage it. From the perspective of a wildfire, a plant is not a living organism producing oxygen and harboring wildlife. A plant is stored energy. It takes sunlight through photosynthesis and converts it into biomass. And every hectare of that biomass is a reservoir of fuel waiting for the right conditions to release it. The abandonment of European rural land has been filling that reservoir for 50 years. And climate change has been turning up the heat beneath it. Spain's fire danger season used to run for 2 or 3 months in the hottest part of summer. Senior meteorologist Jim Dale, who tracks fire weather across Europe and the Mediterranean, puts the current figure at 7 to 8 months. 7 to 8 months of conditions in which a single ignition source, whether that is a fallen power line, a passing train, a carelessly discarded cigarette, or deliberate act of arson, can produce a catastrophic fire. The window between the end of winter rain and the first autumn storms has expanded dramatically, as spring rainfall has shifted, reduced, or arrived too early to sustain the vegetation through the long, dry stretch that follows. What was once a brief and manageable danger period has become the dominant condition of the Mediterranean year. The fire that killed 13 people in Spain's Almería region was triggered, according to multiple witnesses and preliminary investigation, by a fallen power line near the town of Los Gallardos. Sparks hit dry vegetation. The fire that started from those sparks moved through 7,000 hectares in 4 to 5 days, moving so fast and so unpredictably that mayors of small towns were going door to door, physically knocking on residents' doors to alert them they had minutes to leave. The state capital of Almería province experienced smoke so dense it was visible from orbit. Families were trapped on roads as vehicles ahead of them caught fire. People who had lived in those villages their entire lives described having their souls pulled out of their bodies by what they came back to find. Or could not come back to find, because there was nothing left. And here is the number that should stop every policymaker in Europe cold. That fire, which represents a genuine humanitarian catastrophe by any historical standard, burned approximately 7,000 hectares. In 2025, Spain burned 380,177 hectares in total. That is 4. 6 times the country's 17-year average for the same period. Portugal burned 265,139 hectares. That is 3. 7 times its long-term average. These are not margin of error fluctuations. They are not statistical noise. They are the signature of a system that has fundamentally changed. The Fontainebleau fire in France tells a different part of the same story. Fontainebleau is not a remote wilderness. It is a forest that French kings hunted through in the 16th century. It sits 40 kilometers south of the center of Paris, directly adjacent to major rail lines and motorways that carry hundreds of thousands of people through every day. When fire described as exceptional in scale tore through it, train services were suspended, highways were closed, and France was confronted with a reality it has been reluctant to fully accept. Wildfire is no longer a southern European problem that affects people in rural Spain and Portugal and Greece, while Paris watches safely from a distance. The fire came to within 40 kilometers of the Eiffel Tower. And it came in a country that has recorded over 60 arrests for arson in a single summer season, 60 people accused of deliberately lighting fires in conditions specifically designed by nature and human history to make those fires uncontrollable once lit. The arson dimension of the European fire crisis is one that deserves more serious attention than it typically receives. Dr. Beatrice Cremedes, an international climate expert at Chatham House in London, makes a point that is both obvious and frequently overlooked. The majority of European wildfires are started by human activity, either deliberately or accidentally. The climate is not lighting these fires. A human hand or a human-made infrastructure failure is lighting almost every one of them. What climate change has done is ensure that when those fires are lit, the conditions surrounding them are now consistently extreme, rather than occasionally extreme. A cigarette thrown from a car window in southern Spain in July 1990 might have started a manageable brush fire that took a day to contain. The same cigarette in the same spot in July 2025, after weeks without rain, with vegetation moisture at its lowest recorded level and temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius, starts a monster that 1,000 firefighters cannot contain for a week. This is the mechanism that is accelerating the crisis. Human ignition sources have not increased dramatically. Human negligence and criminal intent have always existed. What has changed is that the environment has become catastrophically receptive to those ignitions in ways it simply was not 30 years ago. Every fire that is deliberately set in these conditions is not merely vandalism or criminal damage. It is a mass casualty event waiting to happen in a landscape that has been preloaded with fuel by decades of land abandonment and preheated by a climate system that Europe has helped push into instability. Now let us talk about Europe specifically, because there is a fact about this continent that almost never appears in standard coverage of climate change, and that explains why what is happening here is more alarming than almost anywhere else on Earth. Europe is the fastest warming continent on the planet, not slightly faster than average, twice as fast. The European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts and the World Meteorological Organization confirmed in their most recent joint assessment that Europe has been warming at twice the rate of the global average since the 1980s. Over the last 3 decades, the continent's annual average temperature has risen by 56 degrees Celsius per decade, compared to a global average rise of 27 degrees Celsius per decade. In 2025, 95% of the entire European continent recorded above-average annual temperatures, not in a single month, across the entire year. Dr. Cremedes offers an analogy that cuts through the abstraction more effectively than any graph. The human body operates normally at approximately 36. 5 to 37 degrees Celsius. A fever of 38 degrees, just 1 degree above normal body temperature, makes you feel so ill that you cannot get out of bed. You cannot function. Everything hurts. Now imagine that condition is permanent, intensifying, and happening to an entire continent's ecological and atmospheric systems simultaneously. That is not a metaphor for what might happen. That is a description of what is already in progress. And the projections across every credible climate model point in the same direction. Even in low-emission scenarios, the temperature increases already locked into the system by past emissions mean that what Europe is experiencing right now is not the peak. It is the early middle of a curve that continues upward. The specific mechanics of how higher temperatures interact with wildfire behavior are worth understanding in detail, because they explain why the fires of 2025 were so much harder to fight than the fires of even a decade ago. When a fire burns in a landscape, one of the critical windows for firefighters and aerial resources has always been the nighttime. As the sun sets, temperatures drop, relative humidity rises, wind speeds typically decrease, and the fire's behavior becomes more manageable. Firefighting crews use this window to build containment lines, to get ahead of the fire perimeter, to do the strategic work that becomes nearly impossible during peak burning conditions in the middle of the afternoon. The entire operational model of fire suppression in Europe has been built around this assumption. Nighttime gives you breathing room. Climate change is eliminating that breathing room. Higher nighttime temperatures, driven by elevated moisture in the air, what meteorologists call elevated dew points, mean that the overnight cooling that used to drop a Mediterranean landscape from 35 degrees to 15 degrees is now dropping it from 38 degrees to 26 degrees. The fire barely slows. The fuel does not recover enough moisture to significantly reduce its combustibility, and firefighters who worked through the heat of the day trying to contain the perimeter arrive at the overnight shift to find that the window they were counting on has been compressed to a fraction of what it used to be, or has not appeared at all. Research cited in the European State of the Climate Assessment confirms that what scientists call fire-friendly hours, the periods during which conditions actively support rapid fire spread, have increased dramatically across temperate regions of Europe. The fundamental operational assumption of fire suppression strategy is becoming obsolete faster than the agencies responsible for fighting these fires are adapting to it. Now let us talk about what distinguishes the countries that have navigated this crisis with fewer casualties from those that have suffered the worst outcomes. Because the fire behavior in a given year is largely determined by conditions outside any government's control. The temperature, the rainfall deficit, the wind, the humidity, these things are set by the atmosphere, not by policy. But the number of people who die, the number of homes that burn, the number of communities that lose everything, these things are not set by the atmosphere. They are set by the decisions made in the years and decades before the fires arrive. Portugal provides the most instructive case study, and it is one that comes with an important qualifier. Portugal has suffered devastating fire seasons, including the catastrophic 2017 fires at Pedrógão Grande that killed 66 people in a single afternoon, and represent one of the most lethal wildfire events in European history. But since 2017, Portugal has invested heavily in a systematic reform of how it manages its rural landscape, specifically targeting the fuel accumulation problem. The government created integrated landscape management programs designed to reduce the continuous biomass connection across large areas of countryside by creating strategic breaks in vegetation cover, promoting prescribed burning as a professional land management tool, and reintegrating some form of human activity into landscapes that had been abandoned for generations. Portugal also expanded its professional firefighting capacity, improved aerial resources, and invested in early detection systems. The results are imperfect. The fires of 2025 were still devastating in Portugal. The country still burned 265,000 hectares. But the comparison is instructive. Portugal, which has been doing this work for 8 years, is managing a situation that would otherwise be even worse. The countries that have not made equivalent investments in landscape management and preparedness are discovering that the gap between awareness of the risk and structural response to the risk is measured not in policy debates, but in burned communities and body counts. Spain presents a more complicated picture. The country has a firefighting capacity that is genuinely impressive by European standards. More aircraft, more ground crews, more machinery than ever before. The response to the Almería fires involved immediate mobilization of substantial resources, and survivors and local officials were largely grateful for how quickly emergency services arrived and how decisively they worked. But speed of response and capacity to suppress are not the same as prevention. The fuel that allowed that fire to spread 7,000 hectares in 4 days was already there, already desiccated, already positioned by decades of rural abandonment across hillsides that used to be grazed or farmed but now exist as continuous fire-ready vegetation. The firefighters arrived fast and worked heroically. The landscape was already ready to burn with a violence that could not be simply suppressed by any number of aircraft and ground crews once it started moving. Juan Pecos makes a point that deserves to be understood by every national government with fire-exposed territory. The responsibility for managing fire risk across the landscape is not the exclusive property of national fire agencies or emergency services. It belongs to forest owners. 70% of Spanish forest land is privately owned, to the companies and public authorities responsible for power lines and rail infrastructure, to agricultural ministries, to local mayors, to individual homeowners. On the same day that Spain was managing a major catastrophe in Almería, 8 separate fires were ignited in Galicia along a single railway line. The heat-dried vegetation adjacent to the tracks was catching fire from the sparks generated by passing trains. Not from arson, not from downed power lines, from the routine operation of rail infrastructure through a landscape that had reached a state of combustibility never anticipated when those rail lines were originally built and maintained. If train operators, power companies, forest owners, local governments, and national emergency services are not all coordinated around the same risk framework and the same landscape management strategy, one breach in that system, one unmaintained right-of-way, one uncleared roadside verge, one summer without prescribed burning will undo the work of everyone else. Here's what the online reaction to European wildfires almost always gets wrong, and it is worth addressing directly because misinformation in this space has real consequences. Every time a major European fire season develops, a predictable set of narratives floods across social media. Wildfires are entirely caused by arson, and climate change is a convenient excuse used by governments that failed to prevent them. Or alternatively, wildfires are entirely caused by climate change, and anyone who mentions arson is attempting to deny the scientific consensus. Both of these framings are wrong in ways that matter practically. The honest picture is significantly more complex and requires holding 2 things simultaneously. Yes, human ignition, whether accidental or deliberate, starts the overwhelming majority of European wildfires. And yes, climate change has transformed the conditions in which those ignitions occur so comprehensively that fires, which would previously have been minor incidents, are now catastrophes. These 2 facts are not in competition. They are both true and they both matter, because the policy responses they require are completely different. Addressing ignition sources requires investment in infrastructure maintenance, public education, law enforcement, and landscape buffers around communities. Addressing the underlying climate condition requires the sustained emissions reduction work that European governments have committed to but have not uniformly delivered. And addressing the fuel accumulation crisis that has developed across decades of rural abandonment requires landscape management investment at a scale that no European country has yet fully mobilized. Treating wildfires as purely a criminal problem, something to be solved by arresting more arsonists, ignores the fact that even if every arsonist and every careless smoker were somehow removed from the equation, lightning, infrastructure failures, and agricultural burning would still ignite fires in landscapes that are now catastrophically ready to burn. And treating wildfires as purely a climate problem, something that will only get better when emissions fall, ignores the fact that the fuel accumulation crisis and the lack of landscape resilience are problems that exist right now and can be addressed through land management policy right now before the climate trajectory has been altered. Let me be direct about the practical message here. Because information without a path forward is anxiety that cannot act on itself. If you are going to Southern Europe this summer, or any summer from this point forward, the concept of wildfire risk needs to be part of how you think about your trip, the same way flood risk or road safety is part of how you think about travel. Before you travel, check whether the region you are visiting has active fire danger warnings in place. The European Forest Fire Information System publishes real-time fire danger forecasts across the continent, and they are publicly available. When you arrive, know where your nearest major road out of the area runs. Know whether that road might be your only viable exit route if a fire develops uphill of you. Know the local emergency number. In Spain, it is 112. In France, it is 18 for fire services or 112 for general emergency. If you see smoke in the distance during the day, take it seriously immediately. Do not wait to see if it grows. A fire moving through dry Mediterranean scrubland can cover ground at a rate that makes delay fatal. Jim Dale, who has spent years thinking specifically about how members of the public survive wildfire encounters, makes a point about vehicles that is counterintuitive and genuinely important. A car feels like protection, but in many wildfire scenarios, it becomes a trap. The tires are combustible, the fuel tank is combustible, the seats are combustible. In the Almería fires, people who tried to escape by car found themselves boxed in on burning roads with nowhere to go. If you are on foot, moving toward bare ground, a lake, a river, or any area with no vegetation is more protective than a vehicle in the wrong place. If you must shelter from an approaching fire and cannot evacuate, get to the lowest ground available, face down, cover yourself with anything non-synthetic you can find, and protect your airways. The smoke, not the flames, is what kills most people in wildfire encounters. A smoke mask, or even a wet cloth over your face, buys time that bare lungs do not have. If you live in a fire-prone area of Europe, the single most impactful action you can take is the defensible space around your home. The 30 meters of ground immediately surrounding any structure is what determines whether an approaching fire reaches it with enough intensity to ignite it. Clear dry grass, cut back shrubs that connect to the structure, remove dead vegetation from gutters and against walls. None of this prevents fire from reaching the vicinity of your home. It determines whether the fire, when it arrives, finds the fuel it needs to consume your building, or finds a break that forces it to diminish before it reaches the structure itself. This is not complex or expensive. It is labor over an afternoon or a weekend that makes a material difference between surviving a fire that passes through your area and losing everything. Know your evacuation trigger. Do not wait for an official order to come through your phone before you start moving. In the Almería fires, mayors were physically knocking on doors because official communication systems were overwhelmed. Set your own threshold. If you see a smoke column developing in conditions that are hot, dry, and windy, and you're downhill or downwind of it, that is your signal. Do not wait for confirmation. Move toward your pre-identified escape route, toward your pre-identified safe location, and call emergency services to report your location and your direction of travel. And here's the broader message that supersedes all the individual survival advice. Dr. Cremades articulates it clearly when she describes adaptation as the Cinderella of climate policy. Europe has spent years debating emission targets, net zero timelines, and transition economics. All of that work is necessary and genuinely important. But it addresses the temperature trajectory of the coming decades, while the fires are burning right now in landscapes that have already been transformed by 50 years of rural abandonment and 40 years of above-average warming. The investment in early warning systems, in landscape management, in prescribed burning programs and community-level preparedness campaigns, in infrastructure hardening for power lines, and rail routes through fire-prone terrain, this investment is not happening at the pace that the fire behavior of the last 3 summers demands. Europe has examples to follow, not perfect models, because no model for managing wildfire in a warming climate is perfect anywhere in the world, but serious programs with measurable results. Countries in the Mediterranean that have invested in community-level fire awareness for decades, that have built the village-level knowledge of risk and basic response into local culture, rather than relying entirely on national agencies arriving from a distance. These communities are not fireproof, but they are meaningfully more resilient than those that are experiencing their first serious fire seasons with no framework for response and no understanding of what the landscape around them is capable of when conditions align. The fires of this summer did not come without warning. Juan Pecos and scientists like him across the European research community have been publishing the analysis, presenting the projections, and using precisely the word that describes the current situation, foreseeable, for more than a decade. The collision of the climate train and the land abandonment train was not a secret. The accumulation of fuel across the abandoned rural landscape of southern Europe was not invisible. The warming trajectory of the fastest heating continent on Earth was not ambiguous. What those 13 people in Almería needed was not better science. The science was already there. What they needed was for the decisions that the science demanded to have been made years earlier by the governments, the land managers, the infrastructure operators, and the communities that shared the landscape with them. That is the central truth that sits beneath every wildfire catastrophe this continent has produced and will produce. The fire is a geological and atmospheric event. The death toll is a human decision made in advance. Japan chose decades ago to treat earthquake risk as a human variable and not a fixed cost. The result of that choice is measured in 0 deaths from a magnitude 7, 4 earthquake, in a country of 125 million people. Portugal began making different choices after 2017. The results are imperfect, but they are measurable. Europe as a whole has not yet made the choice at the scale the situation demands. The summer is not over. The landscape has not cooled. The fuel is still there. And every year that the temperature rises and the rainfall decreases across the fastest warming continent on Earth, the reservation of energy stored in that abandoned rural vegetation grows larger and more dangerous. The fires will return. The conditions that produce them are not seasonal, they are structural. The only question that matters from this point forward is not whether Europe will burn again. It will. The question is, who will have made the decisions before the next ignition that determine how many people live through it? Subscribe so you do not miss a single update as this fire season continues, and as new research on European wildfire risk comes in, leave that comment. Tell me where you are watching from and whether you have experienced wildfire firsthand. Tell me if your community is prepared or if this is the first time you have seriously thought about what the landscape around you might do under the conditions that are now becoming normal. Because these are not distant environmental events. They are the defining emergency of European summers for the foreseeable future. And understanding that is where preparation begins. 5,000 likes. Let us go. See you in the next one.